Thank you, Colleen. Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. Great honour to be asked to do the first input. And I think this sounds like a really valuable series of seminars, and thanks to the three partners who have set it up. As Colleen has said, the whole focus for the series is about understanding teachers' learning. And today we were asked to focus particularly on the evidence. What do we know about teachers' learning? And so I've just taken that as my title. I've been given half an hour, and I think I should say the kind of health warning would be that all I can offer in half an hour are some personal reflections on what we do and don't know about teachers' learning. It's necessarily at a very general level, and really I think as the opening contribution for the whole series, what I'm trying to do is set up some propositions really for critical analysis in the rest of the series. Some signposts, if you will, for the series. And Colleen suggested that I should kick off with my talk this morning, which seems highly appropriate in this particular setting. What I want to do is offer a kind of personal introduction on how I tend to see these things, which may not be the same way as everybody else sees them. Something about the importance of how we actually understand what teaching is, in other words, conceptions of teaching. Then to say something about the fact that actually teachers' learning may have different phases during a teacher's career, and their learning needs and dispositions may change during that time. So there's a danger in having too fixed a view of what teachers' learning is all about. Then to offer some very brief reflections on different models, different ways of actually understanding professional learning, and to then try and finish with one or two what I might call building blocks or principles really for understanding teachers' learning. So that's what I'm going to do in the half hour that I've got. By way of introduction, I've got two kind of lenses through which I tend to come at these things. The first is to say that I believe we best understand teachers and teachers' learning through looking at the history of teachers, the cultural setting in which they're working, and the political context in which they're working. The history of teachers is, of course, a fascinating one in whichever country you look at. The relationship they have to each other, to the communities they serve, and to the state is deeply fascinating. And certainly for somebody who's worked in two parts of the curiously named United Kingdom, I've been able to see the influence of the culture and cultural context on the ways that teachers are perceived, valued, and the way in which their work is framed. And certainly relationships between the teaching workforce and the state change historically, but they also differ culturally. And you can see that within the United Kingdom, let alone looking more internationally. And then the second kind of lens through which I see these things is through this complex relationship. Although it's depicted as a continuous circle, of course it's not like that at all. It's a very broken, disrupted, fragmented relationship very often. As somebody based in a university, of course, I do value and place great significance on the contribution that research ought to be able to make to the framing of teachers' work and teachers' learning. But all too often we know that research can be distorted, selectively used, and even, dare I say it, misused by governments and policymakers as they formulate policy. And quite often, it's teachers themselves in classrooms who create the real framing of their work and their learning, and the kind of work we've seen over recent years by the likes of Stephen Ball has shown how much agency, even in these times of apparent great constraint, how much agency teachers still can bring to bear on the way in which they're working in classrooms. So those two kind of framing devices, the relationship of history, culture and politics, and the relationship between research, policy and practice, kind of underpin the way in which I tend to see teachers' work and their learning. Let us turn then to consider some conceptions of teaching. Sorry on a Monday morning to bring you down to earth with a bump, but you should realise that teaching is a craft and is best learnt as an apprentice observing a master craftswoman, or man or woman. Some civil servant obviously attended to that sentence carefully. Watching others and being rigorously observed yourself as you developed is the best route to acquiring mastery in the classroom. Now, I need to be very careful to make it clear that that is not a bad sentence in itself. It's not erroneous in itself, but to suggest that that is the only element of becoming a teacher and learning as a teacher, I think is deeply erroneous. As you start to see in the next statement, we will reform initial teacher training so that more training is on the job and focuses on key teaching skills. Now again, these are important things, the teaching of early reading and mathematics, managing behaviour, but they do imply a very narrow agenda, a very political agenda, a very populist agenda, and they do have the potential to do considerable damage to how we understand teaching in all its complexity. And of course, these are extracts from the white paper, The Importance of Teaching, which was published in November 2010. Which does seem quite a long time ago in some senses, but it's also very recent because we're still playing out the notions in that white paper, still seeing the policy that has followed from that white paper. And that's a suitably dark picture. Fortunately, you can't see all that well, but behind him it says "The Big Society," which is almost the reverse of the kind of notion of teaching that is offered in the white paper. I think it's a small society vision of teaching. In January 2011, I was still in Scotland at that time, an alternative view of teaching came out, which almost seemed to respond to the white paper, although it was never framed in that way, of course, because one of the things this alternative view, which was the Donaldson report called Teaching Scotland's Future, written by a professional educator, not by a politician, although he has certain political skills. Graham Donaldson was the former Chief Inspector for Education in Scotland and was asked when he retired to review teacher education provision, and came up with a much more nuanced and, dare I say, complex view of how teaching skills, teaching work is developed. Yes, there are craft components, so there's no dispute about there being a craft element in all of this, but it must be based and informed by fresh insights in how to best meet increasingly fast change. Simply advocating more time in the classroom, which does seem to be an allusion to what was happening in England, simply advocating more time in the classroom is not the answer to creating better teachers. Sometimes very complex and challenging circumstances. Teachers are reflective and accomplished and inquiring professionals who have the capacity to engage fully with the complexities of education and to be key actors in shaping and leading educational change. They're not just deliverers, they're not just craftspeople in classrooms. They have a professional contribution to make to the shaping and forming of educational experience. And this is a very different view. it doesn't actually necessarily mean that what actually happens in Scottish classrooms is incredibly different from what happens in English classrooms, but it does mean that the framing of that work, the discourse around that work, has a different flavour to it. And this was certainly my experience of working for 11 years north of the border, that there was a different cultural positioning, a different framing of the nature of teachers' work. There's an even worse picture, I'm afraid, of Graham Donaldson. So let's move on. Just before that, though, both Donaldson and Gove are very astute in a small p political sense. And they're both aware, and both reports refer to, either implicitly or explicitly, such international comparators as the PISA league tables, or indeed to OECD reports. They're both deeply sensitive to that international context and to the global competitive nature of education as currently framed, the knowledge economy, and all of that. So how is it they come to such different conclusions about the nature of teaching? Anyway, one of the sensible things that Graham Donaldson did was to commission a literature review, which we were fortunate at Glasgow to win the contract for. And in that literature review, which is still there on the Scottish Government website, and Viv played a part in that process as well, one of the things we did in reviewing literature on teacher education in the 21st century, and we were asked to concentrate on literature produced in this century, we suggested that if you read all of the literature, the grey literature, the research literature, the policy literature, you can tease out different models, different conceptions of teaching. And we suggested 4 particular paradigms, and in fact Colleen picked this up in the introduction to your recent Cambridge Teacher book collection. So just some of you may have seen this either in our literature review or elsewhere. So it's a kind of version of Hoyle's old spectrum from the restricted professional through to the extended professional. But it's trying to break it down into a bit more different types. At the core of teaching is a concern about effectiveness. There's no doubt about that skills, teaching skills in classrooms are important. The content of what is being learned is important, but it's a notion that is around teacher performance and about what can be measured in teaching and in classrooms. So it has a limited kind of conception. It's most closely aligned, of course, with that apprenticeship model that Gove was talking about. In reality, of course, there are very few teachers who are quite so narrow in their approach to their work. Most, I think, teachers would aspire to elements of the reflective teaching paradigm, where certainly skills, content are important, but also knowledge about learners, actually explicit discussion about why things are being taught and why we are teaching in the way that we are teaching, and about the purposes of education. And that reflective teacher model, of course, has been very influential in much teacher education, particularly in initial teacher education over the last 20 years or so, as teacher education institutions have responded to the increasing encroachment on their work by central government. It's been part of the, as it were, management of that process to talk about the reflective teacher. But of course, even before that time of government intervention and encroachment in teacher education, we did have models of the inquiring teacher, which is to say that it's not just about reflection and thinking how do I improve, but it's about drawing on systematic methods of research and inquiry. And of course I'm alluding there to 1975 and Lawrence Stenhouse and the whole movement of teacher as researcher teacher that he was so influential in starting. So bringing systematic inquiry methods in, using research and evaluation methods and techniques. So it's bringing more skills, a greater repertoire of what teachers need to know, teacher knowledge, into the equation. And there is beyond that, I'm using a metaphor of a spectrum, I think, the notion of the transformative teacher, or as Judith Sachs would call it, teaching as an activist profession. It's taking all of the elements of the first three paradigms, but saying, actually, as Donaldson almost does go almost as far as this to suggest teachers should be leading and managing change. Well, he may not want the kind of social change to come from teachers that is aspired to in some of the models that Judith Sachs and others would promote, or Paulo Freire would be another, of course, more radical community activist model of teaching. But it's saying, yes, it's about inquiry, but it's critical inquiry, looking beyond the classroom, looking at the social context of learners and teachers, looking at moral and ethical alliances, thinking about teaching as a stance, to use Marilyn Cochrane-Smith's term. So you can see those four paradigms as a kind of continuum or spectrum, and think where we feel most comfortable that in initial or induction or subsequent learning and development we feel we can draw on those models. So my point is to get back to teacher learning and teacher knowledge. What teachers might need to learn and how they might need to learn it does depend on how we understand teaching. In a useful collection from Sharon Gewertz et al. From a ESRC seminar series a few years ago on teacher identity, we have Biesta developing the notion of practical wisdom as being the kind of core value of what teachers need to learn. Or more recently, we have Hargreaves and Fullen using the concept of professional capital as a kind of metaphor for what teachers might need to learn. And either of those notions you can see fitting into one or more of those paradigms. So key point there is what teachers need to know, to learn, depends on the model, the conception of teaching. Next point is about phases or stages in teachers' learning. And these are some pretty obvious points I want to make here, so I don't think there'll be anything of surprise here. The first point is to say that actually teachers' dispositions and needs do change during their teaching career. Whether they're teaching for 5 years, 10 years or 30 years, their particular needs, learning needs, will change as they build their experience. And one of the key ideas there is that there is a connection between teachers' personal stance, experience, and their professional needs and their learning. And of course, Ivor Goodson of this parish, no less, has helped us understand the connection between the personal lives of teachers and their professional learning and development. Schulman has talked about different types of professional knowledge, and that's been a helpful and influential idea. Pedagogical, content knowledge, subject knowledge, etc. You're probably mostly familiar with those ideas. And Helen Timperley, who we're going to hear from shortly, talks in her book about knowledge building, seeing teachers as people who are building their professional knowledge during their careers in a kind of accretional type of way. So these are simple ideas, but they're very important when we're talking about how and what teachers might learn. Chris Day and Pam Salmons, Judy and my colleague, and others in their study, which came out of the book called Teachers Matter, or no, Teacher Matters, Teachers Teachers Matter, that's it. They suggest that you can divide a person who teaches for up to 30 plus years, can divide their career into certain phases, professional life phases, where the learning needs may be quite different at different phases. I mean, I think you could see a certain arbitrariness in this. They do claim in their book that they draw it from the data, but the main point again is to say that there are different needs at different stages in the career. And that's, in a way, not that different from just the old notion of the continuum of professional development. You know, the obvious point, pre-service initial teacher education is a different process from the induction process, is a different process from early professional development. And we've had more work recently on accomplished teaching schemes like the Chartered Teacher scheme in Scotland, and now the Masters of Educational Practice in Wales, and advanced skills teachers in England, all of that. And then into leadership learning, for both within the classroom but also for people taking on more formal leadership roles. So that's the second main area of what I wanted to cover, the phases or stages. The third main area was to think about different models of learning. And just to link the two, are there different models of learning for different age phases? Not to link the two, sorry. No, but I'm thinking there of different schooling stages. So does a person, a practitioner in the early years setting, have the same kind of learning needs as somebody in a secondary school? The obvious answer is that there may be some needs that are similar, but there'll be others that are different. And you know, don't want to labour that point, but it seems to me that may not be one model of professional learning for all teachers across the different age phases. If we use Bernstein's 3 message systems for asking questions about this, curriculum, pedagogy, and what he called evaluation. If we think about curriculum, we immediately perhaps think of teachers as curriculum developers in a Stenhouse sense of it. If we think about pedagogy, we think about the kind of notions that Robin Alexander has developed about dialogic teaching, or that the many of the post-Vygotskian scholars such as our colleague Anne Edwards and Harry Daniels have developed in how teachers actually construct their learning out of the social context in which they're working. Or if we think about evaluation or assessment, as Bernstein didn't really call it, but has often been interpreted, it's not just about assessment in the classroom, the kind of learning that has occurred for teachers through the formative assessment movement, but it's also about the underpinning educational values, that sense of evaluation, and really bringing questions about value positions into teacher learning and development. So I think those 3 message systems can be helpful. There's also, of course, the point about the links between professional learning and professional development. There's Colleen referred to the language issues around here and how she settled on teacher learning for the time being at least. But professional learning, professional development, and linking those with school development and school improvement. And the growing kind of, or possible tensions between an individual teacher's learning needs and the needs of the school that they're working in, and the desirability of trying to match those together. There's been a lot of work more recently on work-based learning. We think of, again, of that parish. I think Michael Arrow's work on work-based learning. We think of Heather Hodkinson's project on work-based learning, and Alwyn McNamara, Jean Murray, and Marion Jones have got a book in preparation about teacher work-based learning that will come out later this year, I think. So the whole notion of work-based learning is an important one. In terms of practical models or implementation models for some of these ideas. There are things going on, interesting innovations. Some of them based on old models. You know, the school-based teacher education is not a new concept, Mr. Gove. It's been around for 30 or so years, including the University of Sussex, University of Oxford, University of Cambridge, and numerous others. But there are some new ideas being built on top of those old models. In Glasgow, we were developing a clinical practice model of teacher education, which is having quite a big influence in the wake of the Donaldson report. In Oxford, we're currently using the terminology an education deanery, which is building on school-based teacher education to bring research and continuing learning more into the frame than it has been in the old internship scheme, which many of you will be familiar with. And more generally, the whole notion of communities of practice, communities of inquiry, drawing on Leif, Wenger, and so on, are all important new ideas. So, moving towards a conclusion, we are, most of us here, working in England for our sins at present. We are living in a world where government has intervened, certainly since 1984, increasingly in teacher education and professional learning. The best thing about the white paper was its title, because teaching is important. But what it doesn't really, I've got four things that I think it doesn't do justice to that need to be considered when we are being serious about teacher learning and teacher knowledge. The first is the importance of context. It really does matter who we're talking about and where they're working and with whom. And again, to use one of Helen Timperley's notions or terms, she talks about teachers as adaptive experts, which I think is a powerful notion that, yes, teachers do need expertise, but a key element of their expertise is being able to adapt to the changing context in which they find themselves. So context is very important. Secondly, teachers are moral agents. They have moral responsibilities in their work, and that is why they should be able to debate and espouse and challenge on the basis of values. It does matter what happens in classrooms. Thirdly, I'd talk about the importance of inquiry, and hopefully that inquiry is going to be collaborative in a true Stenhousian type model, but the key element is that we use inquiry as teachers to learn about our own practice, to learn from each other, to improve our own practice and to improve schools. And fourthly, there is importance in the notion of leadership, but that isn't just about management as we now understand it. It is about leadership in classrooms, leadership in teams, leadership in faculties, leadership in schools and in communities. And that in particular is where I want to highlight the role of the university in leading educational change, because that role is being undermined and attacked, particularly in England at the moment. The extent to which politicians have been allowed to intervene in the policy and practice of teacher formation and teacher development is deeply disturbing. Most concerning of all is initial teacher education in England at present. We should not have allowed politicians, fly-by-night politicians, they're only there, most of them, and Gove's survived longer than most, but the most any of them are ever there is 3 or 4 years, or 5 at the most. We should not allow fly-by-night politicians, and it says on my notes, or their stooges, I can't imagine who I'm thinking of, to interfere and intervene so regularly over such short time periods that don't have a longer term understanding of the impact of short-term policies. So I finish with a call to reclaim the ground, the professional ground for teachers' learning and teachers' knowledge, and to mention 2 or 3 current developments. I know we're going to come on to current developments later as well, but the British Educational Research Association jointly carried out a study with USET, the University's Council for the Education of Teachers, which was published just over a year ago, looking at the impact of current and planned policies in education on educational research in the United Kingdom. And one of the findings there was that teacher education policies had the great risk of severely undermining the contribution of educational research to the improvement of education in the country. And so there is now, just getting underway, an inquiry being launched by BERA to look at that. And there'll be a number of papers commissioned, there'll be a number of events happening which look at how current teacher education policies are impacting on educational research. But listening recently to Mary James talk about the new curriculum proposals in England, and she was a member of that expert panel, of course, which was somewhat ignored, putting it politely, in its recommendations. One of the things she suggested was we should be calling for a board of education to take it out of these fly-by-night politicians' hands and establish, in a democratic manner, a board of education to take responsibility for the development of curricula, pedagogical and other matters. And there are also discussions afoot about the possibility of setting up a professional body for teachers, which might well be a royal college, because England actually did, I think the only word is screw up, over General Teaching Council. I mean, working in Scotland, one had not everything is perfect there, but one of the things that did maintain a more even trajectory in educational policy developments was the long-standing existence of a reasonably powerful and influential General Teaching Council. Been there since 1965-6 and still flourishes and thrives, even though the balance of power within it has shifted quite a lot. The English General Teaching Council survived just over 10 years, didn't it? From 2001 until about now, when it's finally been dismantled. And it was not necessarily set up on the model of the Scottish one, which may have been part of the problem, that didn't have enough actual influence or professional standing, and certainly was not popular with a lot of teachers, which was a major problem, but enabled Gove to close it down fairly quickly when he got there. But I think we do need some kind of professional body for teachers, which is a partnership between key stakeholders. I see in our pack we have another paper that Bob and Tim Brighouse have written, which seems to be calling for a similar kind of professional voice being articulated again. So I do hope that some of these kind of political ideas will inform our discussions as these seminars develop. There's 1 or 2 references there on my final sheet, but I've had my half hour now, so I'll finish, Colleen. Thank you.
Thank you.